Park Avenue looks clean because it is maintained as a surface. The street is wide, the traffic regulated, the facades restored and repainted in cycles. A median divides the lanes like a neat seam, but the avenue's order is a kind of cover. Between East 33rd Street and East 40th Street, under the asphalt and the masonry, there is an older passage, a buried corridor that began as an open rock cut in the 1830s and was later roofed over to suppress noise, smoke, and public anger. It is a tunnel that has never stopped being used and yet has been continually treated as something that should not be seen. In public language, it has several names, and the names matter because each one isolates a different function and a different time. The roadway tunnel that cars pass through at 33rd Street is called the Park Avenue Tunnel, also known historically as the Murray Hill Tunnel. It traces back to the New York and Harlem Railroad's early approach into Manhattan, completed as a cut in 1834 and later enclosed. That basic alignment, north-south, beneath what became Park Avenue, also became the spine for the railroad corridor leading toward Grand Central. The broader rail infrastructure that now runs under and alongside Park Avenue is known as the Park Avenue Main Line, including the Park Avenue Tunnel and the Park Avenue Viaduct in railroad terms. The effect is that a single idea, moving trains through a constrained city, was built, rebuilt, widened, covered, ventilated, electrified, and then half forgotten in plain sight. The forbidden quality in the title is not a matter of signage. It is not a gate with a warning. It is a policy of attention. The city learned more than once that this corridor could not safely be treated as ordinary space. It was infrastructure whose failures were public, physical, and difficult to narrate without implicating everyone: designers, operators, regulators, and commuters. The corridor became a place where accountability was diluted by darkness and by the complexity of systems that seemed too large to blame on any one person. Early New York railroading in Manhattan was an intimate kind of danger. The New York and Harlem Railroad's route up 4th Avenue, later Park Avenue, brought steam locomotives into a city that was still adjusting to the scale of mechanized transport. In the 19th century, the line was progressively altered, the open cut was roofed, sections were grade separated, vents were installed, a shallow tunnel was created in effect, a long lid over tracks, with occasional vents for the smoke and steam to escape, an engineering compromise that controlled surface disruption while retaining a problem it could not truly solve: combustion underground. The tunnel's atmosphere was not a metaphor. It was soot and steam, trapped heat, and visibility that failed abruptly. The public complained about what they could see and smell at street level. The railroad responded by roofing the cut, then roofing more of it. Each improvement to the city above increased the complexity of the environment below. The passage became longer, darker, more dependent on signals and on the memory of crews who ran it daily. When the corridor was open, smoke rose. When it was covered, smoke lingered. A tunnel that was meant to remove trains from Manhattan's surface became, by degrees, a place where trains moved without the normal reference points that keep humans cautious. The key fact of the Park Avenue corridor is that it carries people into the center of New York without allowing them to understand where they are while they are doing it. That is part of what makes it psychologically durable. Even now, the modern passenger riding into Grand Central experiences a kind of controlled blindness, a brief glide into darkness, then a sudden revelation of platforms and light. The perception is of efficiency. The underlying reality is of constrained space, limited clearance, and a constant negotiation between speed, schedule, and safety margins. In January 1902, that negotiation failed in a way that forced the city to look at what had been hidden. On the morning of January 8, 1902, a collision occurred in the Park Avenue Tunnel. Contemporary reports and later reconstructions describe a rear-end crash in darkness and smoke, with a stop signal missed or unreadable. 15 were killed and many injured. The tunnel, built as a safety improvement, became the scene of mass casualty. The detail that survives through every retelling is not drama, but mechanism. Smoke-choked visibility, signals that could not be seen in time, and an environment that created human error as reliably as it created soot. If you stand at street level today, near the park-like interruptions and grates that break the rhythm of Park Avenue's median, you can read them as landscaping. But historically, venting was not aesthetic, it was triage. The corridor's occasional vents were the simplest possible answer to a complex problem: how to dilute and exhaust the byproducts of steam locomotion in a trench that had been turned into a tube. Even when the corridor was not fully enclosed, sections were roofed over, leaving openings that acted like chimneys. There were also apertures through which the city could hear what it did not want to see: the hard exhaust beat, the scrape of wheels, the metallic resonance of an enclosed cut. After the 1902 crash, the tunnel stopped being merely unpleasant and became politically untenable. The accident is commonly treated as the impetus behind electrification at Grand Central and the end of steam locomotives in Manhattan. The logic was straightforward. If smoke in the Park Avenue tunnel could blind an engineer, then the tunnel itself was incompatible with steam. The engineering solution was not to make the tunnel larger, Manhattan was already built around it, but to change the motive power. The city moved toward banning steam locomotives from entering Manhattan, forcing railroads to electrify approaches and terminal operations. That policy shift has a narrative that is often told as progress. Clean electric trains replace dirty steam. The city becomes safer. Grand Central Terminal rises as a monument to coordinated modernity. The story is true in outline, but it also hides the darker continuity. The tunnel remained, the corridor remained, and what had been a problem of smoke became a problem of systems. Electrification did not remove the fundamental conditions that make tunnels psychologically corrosive: limited escape routes, long sight lines that vanish into curvature and haze, mechanical noise that rebounds off masonry, the sensation that you are inside a machine whose behavior you cannot meaningfully influence. The forbidden quality of the Park Avenue tunnel is partly bureaucratic. Railroad infrastructure under Manhattan is controlled, monitored, and restricted. Access is deliberate, recorded, limited to crews and authorized personnel. But it is also cultural. The tunnel is physically close to everyday life, beneath expensive apartments and routine commutes, yet it remains outside ordinary curiosity. The corridor's history is remembered only in fragments: an old photo, a passing mention, a fatal wreck recited as a footnote to Grand Central's creation. The tunnel is present, but it is not allowed to be present in the mind. Images of the tunnel tend to show it as a portal, an opening, a mouth of dark brick or stone. That framing is comforting because it implies a boundary. You are either outside it or inside it. But the true structure is not a single opening. It is a system of covered cuts, bores, vents, signal blocks, and interlockings that extend northward. It is multiple spaces that connect and narrow and branch, carrying trains like blood through a concealed artery. A photograph of the portal does not show the pressure changes, the sudden temperature shifts, the vibration that travels into buildings above. It does not show how quickly a minor delay becomes a compressed queue of trains in darkness. In the years after 1902 and through the reconstruction of Grand Central, the Park Avenue corridor became a place where the city demanded that failure never be visible again. That demand shaped the physical environment: better signals, new power, improved ventilation, layers of redundancy. It also shaped the record. Disasters are documented, but the lesser events, the near misses, the smoke episodes, the small fires, the signal irregularities, the worker injuries, often survive only as scattered notes. The tunnel does not need myth to be disturbing. Its disturbance is administrative. a place so necessary that it cannot be shut down and so constrained that it cannot be fully made safe. This documentary begins with that contradiction because it is the one the corridor imposes on everyone who works near it. The Park Avenue Tunnel is not abandoned. It is not a ruin. It is an operational infrastructure with a long memory. It has carried New York into itself for nearly 2 centuries, and in doing so, it has accumulated the kind of history that cannot be displayed without changing how the city feels above it. The unease does not come from the idea of ghosts. It comes from the way a tunnel preserves the conditions of past failures, the same limited clearances, the same dependence on signals, the same requirement that humans make correct decisions in an environment that makes perception unreliable. When something goes wrong underground, it is rarely dramatic at first. It begins as a small delay, an unexpected stop, a radio call that is too calm, and then the tunnel does what tunnels do. It removes options. In part 2, the record becomes more technical, and the fear becomes quieter. We followed the corridor as engineers tried to correct what could be corrected, and as operators learned, sometimes too late, what could not. The Park Avenue corridor was never designed as a single tunnel in the modern sense. It began as a cut, rock removed to create a trench, and then it was roofed over in sections as the city demanded quieter streets and fewer at-grade crossings. That origin is important because it produced a structure with uneven geometry. Parts widened, parts narrowed, parts covered with different materials at different times. Over decades, the corridor became a sequence of spaces rather than one continuous tube, and each space carried its own constraints: clearances, sight lines, drainage behavior, smoke behavior. Those constraints did not disappear with electrification. They shifted their consequences from air quality to operational discipline. When people imagine a railroad tunnel, they imagine a uniform bore with predictable conditions. The Park Avenue route is not that. It is a long, controlled wound in the city's geology, covered and recovered. In some stretches, the roof was installed as a practical lid. In others, the environment above was built out as a boulevard, with buildings that treat the space beneath as a foundation. The result is an infrastructure that is both transportation and subterranean architecture, and therefore subject to different kinds of failure: mechanical failure on the rails, and structural and environmental stress in the surrounding fabric. The 1902 crash forced a reckoning that was partly technological and partly legal. Accounts describing the event emphasized smoke, darkness, and signal visibility, conditions that belonged not only to the moment of impact, but to daily operation. The tunnel was known to be dark, smoky, with poor visibility, and that reputation was not a rumor. It was consistent with steam-era physics in an enclosed space. The collision made the tunnel's risk undeniable, and it provided the political leverage required to force railroads into electrification. The public often remembers electrification as an aesthetic improvement: fewer fumes, cleaner stations, a modern city. For railway engineers, the shift was more clinical. It changed the nature of errors. Under steam, a signal could be missed because an engineer was temporarily blinded by smoke. Under electric tower, the line of sight improved, but the corridor's fundamental limits remained: confined approach tracks, dense traffic, tight block spacing, and high consequences for any failure to obey signals. The operational risk migrated from visibility impairment to the fragility of a system that required continuous correctness. The Park Avenue Tunnel collision of 1902 also shaped how Grand Central's successor terminal was conceived. Grand Central Terminal opened in 1913, and its existence as a multi-level electrified terminal depended on the assumption that steam would not be allowed to continue under Park Avenue. The engineering logic was that trains could be brought in below street level without filling the city's core with combustion exhaust. This is one reason Grand Central Terminal became possible as an underground machine rather than a surface shed. It is not a romantic fact. It is an architectural decision built atop a death toll. If you treat the tunnel as a case study in urban systems, the overlooked flaw is not that it once carried steam locomotives. The overlooked flaw is that it evolved under pressure from the surface. Each change answered a political and social demand: reduce noise, reduce smoke, reduce street disruption, without fully rethinking the corridor as a whole. The tunnel's shape and ventilation were not the product of one unified design, but of successive compromises. This is how dangerous infrastructure tends to form in old cities, not as a single act of engineering, but as layered patchwork where the seams become failure points. In documents and accounts of the period, vents are often described as features, as if their presence solved the smoke problem. The reality is that vents mitigate, they do not remove. A vent allows some exchange with the surface atmosphere, but it also creates an uneven internal climate. Smoke and heat do not distribute evenly, they accumulate in pockets and along ceilings. In a long covered cut, the tunnel's air is shaped by weather, train frequency, and the piston effect of moving cars. This creates changing visibility and changing sensory conditions for crews, one morning clear, the next oppressive. Even with electrification, the tunnel retained a managed atmosphere. It was no longer soot and steam as the dominant threat. It became electrical heat, brake dust, and the constant presence of equipment that fails quietly until it doesn't. Early warning signs after electrification were not always dramatic, and that is the nature of the corridor's hazard. The corridor punishes small deviations. Signal systems, for example, were designed to enforce separation, but their effectiveness depends on maintenance, on the clarity of indications, and on operators' trust. In a constrained tunnel, trains cannot easily be routed around one another. A minor signal fault or a miscommunication can cause a train to stop where it should not, or proceed where it should hesitate. The geometry makes recovery slow. Delays compress. Commuter lines are not spacious, they are scheduled tightly. In an open landscape, a delay is visible. In a tunnel, it is opaque, and opacity produces secondary errors, impatience, assumptions, procedural shortcuts. The 1902 crash was not the only incident in the Park Avenue corridor's history, and the pattern that emerges from later discussions is not of constant catastrophe, but of recurring near failure. Smoke episodes earlier in the 1890s, complaints about the covered cut, and the recognition that the corridor's safety depended on changes that would be expensive and disruptive. When the city decided to act, it acted not only for safety but for civic image. Park Avenue's transformation into a prestigious boulevard depended on burying the railroad and making it behave. The tunnel was required to be both invisible and reliable. Those requirements conflict because invisibility reduces public scrutiny, and scrutiny is often what forces investment. This is where the idea of a forbidden ghost subway begins to become understandable without invoking the supernatural. A corridor can be ghostly simply because it is ignored while still active. It can be forbidden simply because access is restricted and discussion is discouraged, not by explicit censorship, but by cultural fatigue. The tunnel's history is difficult to hold in the mind because it is inconvenient. It says that one of the city's cleanest avenues sits above a route that was once so dangerous that it forced a fundamental change in urban rail technology. The deeper technical detail that matters most is also the simplest. The tunnel leaves little room for human improvisation. In emergencies, evacuation is complicated by narrow maintenance walkways, by the need to de-energize electrical systems, by the difficulty of communicating through thick walls. In earlier eras, smoke filled the space and the instinct was to move away from it, but away meant along the same corridor that might contain another train. After electrification, the risks included electrocution and the danger of stepping into track space with limited sightlines. The tunnel made ordinary safety behaviors, like moving to a safer open area, impossible. Safety had to be procedural and enforced in advance. In a city like New York, the true test of safety is not whether infrastructure works on a clear day, but how it behaves under load, under failure, under misunderstanding. The Park Avenue corridor is always under load. It carries commuter trains into one of the busiest terminals in North America. That density of movement is itself a stressor. The tunnel's strange patterns, when they appear in the record, often appear as patterns of congestion and near miss rather than as single spectacular events. A signal passed at danger, a train stopped where it shouldn't, a worker struck, a small fire that burned itself out but blackened cables. These events rarely form a clean narrative, and therefore they rarely become public memory. But they are the texture of a corridor that operates close to its limits. There is another pattern, subtler, that emerges from accounts of the early 20th century, the relationship between the tunnel's internal environment and human perception. Steam-era engineers reported blindness from smoke. Later operators reported the tunnel as a place where distance is difficult to judge and where time behaves differently because there are no external cues. In long enclosed spaces, sound arrives with delays and reflections. A train ahead can sound closer than it is. A signal can appear suddenly after a curve. The tunnel imposes a sensory discipline, and when that discipline is broken by fatigue, by routine, by complacency, the tunnel does not forgive. This documentary is built around the idea that horror can be structural. The Park Avenue Tunnel does not need legends. Its history is a record of real constraints and the slow violence of forcing a city's growth through a corridor that was never meant to carry what it now carries. The corridor is an artery that cannot be replaced. That is why it was never truly closed, only modified, and why the most disturbing part of its history is not the crash itself, but what followed. The city's determination to treat the corridor as solved, even as the corridor continued to demand constant vigilance. In Part 3, we move into the period when vigilance failed in smaller ways and then in larger ways. Incidents that did not always reach the front page, accounts from workers and riders, and the darkest stretch of operational history when the corridor's silence became a method of containment. If you read the Park Avenue Tunnel's history only through its major public moments, it appears as a solved problem. A deadly collision in 1902, a moral and political response, electrification, the opening of Grand Central Terminal, and then a century of routine. But infrastructure does not become safe because it is modernized. It becomes safe when its daily failures are detected, recorded, and corrected. The darkest period for a system is often not when it is obviously dangerous, but when it is assumed to be safe and therefore allowed to operate with minimal public scrutiny. The tunnel's continued existence as an operational corridor means that most of what happens in it is not witnessed by the public. The people who spend time in the tunnel are crews, maintainers, emergency responders, and occasionally investigators. Their accounts are rarely unified because the tunnel is not one place. It is a sequence of sections with different acoustics and different lighting, joined by curves and junctions that change how a train approaches. The tunnel is also governed by procedure, and procedure has a way of flattening experience into terminology, signal irregularity, trespasser, equipment defect. The emotional content, the moment when a worker realizes that a sound is wrong, or when a rider feels a train stop in darkness longer than expected, rarely appears in official language. The 1902 collision is documented in multiples as a result of a stop signal missed in a smoke-choked tunnel, leading to a rear-end crash with significant fatalities. The tunnel was described as dangerous, dark, with poor visibility. Those words are not dramatic, they are technical descriptors of a space that interfered with perception. After electrification, smoke was no longer the dominant variable, but perception remained unreliable for other reasons. Darkness did not disappear, it shifted. Electric lighting does not turn a tunnel into daylight, it creates islands of illumination and long intervals of shadow. Train headlights flatten depth perception. Reflections off damp surfaces can mimic movement. The tunnel became a space where the system's correctness depended on repeated adherence to signals and on continuous maintenance of those signals. The escalation in this story is not a single disaster that dwarfs 1902. It is the accumulation of smaller incidents that the tunnel absorbs. A modern rail corridor has layers of protection: automatic block signals, interlockings, dispatching, radio communication, and strict rules about track access. The Park Avenue corridor, because of its density and geometry, turns any breach of those layers into immediate risk. This is why the tunnel is haunted in the non-supernatural sense. It is a place where the consequences of mistakes are not abstract, they are spatial. A train cannot swerve. A worker cannot step into a shoulder that does not exist. A stopped train cannot be bypassed easily. The tunnel keeps every error close. There are incidents that remain in public discussion because they connect to visible change. One example is how the 1902 crash helped drive the move away from steam and toward electrification into Manhattan, a shift remembered as a turning point in rail technology and city planning. But the corridor's darker period is defined by what did not produce monuments, what produced internal memos, operational bulletins, and quiet modifications. Consider ventilation and the tunnel's internal climate. The earlier era's solution, roof over the cut and add occasional vents, was described as a way to let smoke and steam escape. That same structural logic persists. The tunnel remains dependent on limited exchange with the outside environment, and its atmosphere is still managed rather than open. In dense commuter operation, the tunnel warms, equipment heats, and air moves in pulses as trains pass. Heat affects electronics. Moisture affects insulation. Brake dust accumulates. The tunnel becomes a place where the environment is always slightly hostile to the systems meant to keep it safe. The most disturbing accounts from such corridors often involve time. In tunnels, delays feel longer because there are no external cues. A train stops, and the rider cannot tell whether it is seconds or minutes. The hum of power changes. Voices lower. In the Park Avenue corridor, trains are close enough together that a stop can mean another train is nearby, unseen. The writer knows this without being told, because modern life teaches people to infer density from schedules. The fear is not panic, it is an internal calculation. If we are stopped, someone ahead is stopped, and behind us, someone is moving unless someone has already told them not to. In the tunnel's working culture, there is a known phenomenon. Spaces that demand constant attention tend to normalize near failure. A crew member experiences an irregular signal once, and it is frightening. They experience it again, and it becomes an anecdote. They experience it repeatedly, and it becomes routine. The system continues to operate, and the human mind adjusts. This adjustment is a risk in itself because it lowers the psychological alarm threshold. The tunnel's darkest period is therefore not tied to a calendar, it is tied to the point at which routine and hazard overlap so completely that the hazard becomes invisible. The corridor's physical form reinforces that invisibility. From above, Park Avenue presents continuity, a clean line of roadway, a median, buildings that imply permanence. The rail corridor beneath is treated as a service space, accessed through controlled portals and maintained in segments. The very way maintenance is performed, at night in restricted windows, creates a culture of partial knowledge. One crew works one section, another crew works another. The tunnel is known in pieces. This fragmentation is operationally practical, but psychologically corrosive. It means that no one holds the entire corridor in mind except in diagrams. And diagrams, while precise, do not convey the sensation of being inside the space when something fails. As the decades progressed, Grand Central and its approaches became among the most complex terminal operations in the country. Complexity produces resilience, but it also produces failure modes that are hard to interpret. A train stops because of an upstream issue. The downstream operator sees only the stop. A signal indicates danger because a track circuit detects occupancy. The reason for occupancy may be a train, a maintenance worker, or a fault. In the tunnel, the difference is not academic. The corridor's danger comes from ambiguity. There is an old administrative instinct in urban rail: keep the core moving. When something happens underground, the priority is to restore service. This instinct is understandable, the city depends on it, but it also shapes what becomes visible. A minor incident is treated as an interruption to be managed, not as a story to be told. Reports are written, but they are written for internal use. The public learns only what affects them directly: delays, occasional headlines, a brief mention of an incident. Over time, this creates an informational darkness that mirrors the tunnel's physical darkness. The disturbing accounts in this story are therefore often indirect. They come from how the tunnel is described in authoritatives as notorious for heat, soot, and fumes in the steam era, as a place where an engineer could be temporarily blinded by smoke, as a corridor whose conditions made it hazardous enough to drive legislative and technological change. The words are measured, but they point to a reality that is inherently unsettling. A major city's central rail approach depended for decades on an environment that routinely compromised human senses. In the darkest period, after the spectacular event has faded, but before the corridor has been mythologized into safety, the tunnel becomes a place where the small failures matter most. A maintenance worker steps onto ballast expecting a clear track and hears the distant vibration of an approaching train before the radio confirms it. A dispatcher watches a line of signals change state in a pattern that suggests a fault, but cannot be sure. A train operator experiences a momentary loss of power or a flicker in indications and must decide whether to proceed. None of these moments require the supernatural. They require only a system operating close to its limits and human beings who must interpret partial information in an environment designed to conceal. The escalation is also institutional. After 1902, New York acted decisively on steam and electrification, but that decisive action created a narrative of closure. The problem was solved. When a society believes a problem has been solved, it becomes less willing to fund the less visible work of prevention. The tunnel's continued operation relies on such prevention: inspection of tunnel lining, cable systems, signal relays, track circuits, drainage, and emergency lighting. The tunnel is a machine that must be continuously reasserted against entropy. Its horror is that entropy is patient. By the time modern riders pass through the corridor, the surface city has trained them to expect reliability. Grand Central is a landmark. It is visited and photographed. It is associated with order and design. The tunnel that feeds it is not photographed by commuters. It is not part of the civic imagination. This separation between image and reality is the condition that allows a corridor like this to retain its psychological presence. It is a ghost, not because it is empty, but because it is systematically excluded from attention. In Part 4, we do not resolve the tunnel into a legend. We follow what happens after incidents fade, how records thin out, how institutional memory becomes selective, how the tunnel persists as a working space that cannot be spoken about with the simplicity the public prefers. The aftermath is not a closing statement, it is a continuing condition. After a disaster, cities do two things at once. They correct what can be corrected, and they begin the work of forgetting. Forgetting is not always denial. Often it is a practical necessity. The city cannot afford to hold every hazard in conscious thought. It must continue to function. The Park Avenue Tunnel, whether understood as the older Murray Hill roadway tunnel lineage or the broader railroad main line approach into Grand Central, exists inside that contradiction. It persists because New York requires it to persist, and because it persists, it becomes an environment where memory is managed. The public record is clear on several points. The Park Avenue Tunnel collision of January 8, 1902, killed 15 people and injured many more in a rear-end crash attributed to poor visibility and signals missed in a smoke-choked dark tunnel. The consequence was not merely grief, it was policy. The city moved toward banning steam locomotives from Manhattan and forcing electrification, a shift that helped make the modern Grand Central possible. That chain of cause and effect is often framed as a triumph of reform. But reform in an underground corridor does not end the story. It changes the form of the story. Once steam was removed, the tunnel no longer produced the same kind of evidence. Smoke had been visible, soot had been tangible on clothing, on building facades near vents, in the smell that lingered on platforms. Steam-era discomfort forced complaints, and complaints forced political response. Electric operation is quieter in the civic sense. Its byproducts are less obvious to those above ground. The tunnel remains a harsh environment, but the harshness becomes technical. Heat in equipment rooms, the slow corrosion of metal fasteners, the accumulation of dust in cable runs, water intrusion through joints that were built in different decades. These are problems that do not photograph well. They do not produce immediate outrage. They produce maintenance schedules and budget requests. The tunnel also becomes a place where the record is necessarily incomplete. Railroads and agencies document incidents, but not every event becomes a public narrative. A corridor this critical is protected by a culture of control. Access is restricted, details are compartmentalized, and communication is focused on restoring service. This is not a conspiracy, it is an operational reflex. The effect, however, is that the tunnel's history after its most famous incident feels thin to outsiders. The tunnel becomes, in the historical sense, a place where shards exist but are not easily assembled into a single story. That is one meaning of forbidden. The tunnel is not forbidden because someone posted warnings for thrill seekers. It is forbidden because it is infrastructure whose safety depends on limiting untrained presence, and because its narrative threatens the clean image of the city above. Park Avenue's transformation into an elite boulevard depended on burying rail operations and making them appear seamless. The corridor beneath is therefore part of an urban bargain. The public receives a refined surface. In exchange, it agrees not to look too closely at the mechanism that makes refinement possible. The tunnel's lasting psychological presence comes from the way it shapes experience without announcing itself. Commuters who enter Grand Central by train do not linger on the approach. It is a transitional space, a brief darkness before arrival. But transitional spaces are powerful in the human mind. They are where control shifts. Above ground, a person can leave a street, take another route, stop, turn back. In a tunnel, a person is committed, the train is committed, the options narrow. That narrowing, repeated daily by hundreds of thousands of people, leaves an imprint even if it is not named. There are physical reminders, subtle and easy to misread. Vents and shafts appear at the surface as grates, small parks, interruptions in the median. Historically, these openings served a clear purpose, allowing smoke and steam to escape when the corridor was roofed over. Today, even with electric trains, the idea of ventilation remains embedded in the corridor's design. The city above contains these apertures like scars that have been landscaped. People sit near them without understanding what they once carried out into the air. The most unsettling aftermath is not physical, it is administrative silence. In transportation systems, silence often indicates success. A corridor that does not make news is a corridor that is functioning. But silence can also indicate something else, that events are treated as routine, absorbed into internal processes, and withheld from wider attention because attention would not help. Over decades, this creates a gap between what is lived by those who work the tunnel and what is known by those who ride it above it or near it. The tunnel becomes psychologically double, omnipresent in operation, absent in civic memory. The 1902 crash remains vivid because it was unavoidably public. It produced bodies, headlines, funerals, and political action. The tunnel's later history, by contrast, is dominated by the kind of incidents that do not translate into a clean moral lesson. A signal fault that is fixed overnight. A small electrical fire is contained before it spreads. A medical emergency on a train that causes a delay. A maintenance worker's injury recorded in a safety report. These events are real and consequential, but they do not offer a single villain or a single reform that can be celebrated. They point instead to the ordinary fragility of complex systems. This is the tunnel's true horror, that it requires continuous, invisible labor to remain tolerable, and that this labor is always performed under the pressure of the city's demand for uninterrupted movement. The people who maintain and operate the corridor are not characters in a story, they are functionaries in a machine. Their vigilance is routine, and routine is the condition that makes modern life possible. But routine is also where human perception dulls, where fatigue becomes invisible, where small deviations are normalized. There is a reason the Park Avenue tunnel collision is repeatedly described in careful terms. Darkness, smoke, missed signals. It is not a story about madness or malice. It is a story about the failure of human senses in an engineered environment. The corridor, as an environment, remains capable of similar failures, not through smoke now, but through the quieter mechanisms of modern infrastructure, a misread indication, a delayed radio call, a maintenance lapse that sets up a later fault. The tunnel does not need to be supernatural to feel haunted. It is haunted by the persistence of conditions that make error likely and consequences severe. In the decades after Grand Central Terminal opened, the city's relationship with its underground spaces became more complex. Subway lines multiplied, utility tunnels expanded, basements deepened, and the ground beneath Manhattan became a stacked environment. The Park Avenue corridor is one of the older layers, a reminder that modern New York was built not only upward, but downward, often without the luxury of rebuilding from scratch. In such a city, the oldest infrastructure tends to become the most psychologically charged because it embodies past compromises that cannot be undone. The tunnel's ghost quality is also reinforced by how it is represented visually. Most images show portals, entrances, and historical moments, like the aftermath imagery associated with the 1902 crash. These images suggest that the tunnel is a discrete place with a beginning and end. In practice, it is a continuous operational zone. It is not visited, it is passed through, and spaces that are passed through repeatedly without being seen develop a particular kind of presence. They become associated with transition, with anticipation, with the slight tension that accompanies any surrender of control. A commuter may not articulate it, but the body registers it. The change in sound, the shift in pressure, the absence of reference points. The aftermath, then, is not a conclusion. It is a long-term condition of forgetting. In archives and curated histories, the Park Avenue corridor is often treated as a precursor to modernity, an early rail cut, an improvement project, a tunnel that helped shape Park Avenue's surface identity. The narrative tends to be upward, from crude steam to clean electric, from dangerous surface tracks to orderly boulevards. But that narrative is only half true. The other half is that the corridor remains a constrained passage through which the city must continuously move its own weight. The fear is not that something unknown lives there. The fear is that the tunnel is known in engineering terms, and that what is known is enough. If you stand near the avenue and listen closely, you can sometimes feel a vibration that does not belong to traffic. It is faint, structural, transmitted through stone and steel. It suggests that beneath the clean surface, something heavy is moving with purpose and with limited room to correct itself. That sensation is not poetic. It is the physical reality of a corridor built in the 19th century and adapted to the demands of the 20th and 21st. The Park Avenue Tunnel is forbidden in the only way that matters. It is a place the city cannot afford to face in full because facing it would require acknowledging how thin the boundary is between normal operation and catastrophe. The corridor's history contains a fatal collision that forced a technological revolution. The corridor's present contains the same structural premise: trains moving through an enclosed space with limited margins. The city's solution is not to eliminate the tunnel. The solution is to keep it working and to keep thinking about it to a minimum. That is why the tunnel remains, year after year, both essential and absent. It is not a legend, it is a working passage with a long memory. Its horror is the calmness of its continued use and the quiet agreement made every day by millions that what lies beneath Park Avenue should stay beneath Park Avenue.